how does carrying a gun read differently when the carrier is black rather than white, say?
The racial politics of this were really fascinating to me. So, in many states, whites are actually, proportionate to their population, more likely to be armed than other groups. But in Michigan, when I was doing my research, that it was actually parity. So, African Americans and whites were per capita armed to concealed carry. They were legally licensed to concealed carry by the state at equal rates, which is actually really surprising when you think that, we know, thanks to mass incarceration and the effect of mass incarceration on African Americans, particularly African American men. We know that African American men are disproportionately going to have a felony record. That is a disqualifier to own a gun, much less get a gun license. And so the fact that the rates were equal, even given that, I think is pretty telling in terms of sort of the desire to carry a gun. So there's two questions, right? Is there a difference in terms of race, in terms of why people are carrying guns? And then also, how is that actually being looked at differently by public law enforcement, for example? So in terms of the why are people carrying guns, this concern about crime and decline, this was actually something I heard from everyone. And of course, we would think that in Detroit, where the murder rate is higher, carjackings, assaults, sexual assaults, all of that is at higher rates in Detroit than in its suburbs. Of course, we would imagine that issues of self-defense and crime would be on the minds of concealed carriers and open carriers as well. So one of the people that I opened my book with, this guy named Jason, he's a Detroiter, and he basically says, I wanted to get a gun license because I have a gut. This is kind of paraphrasing him, but I have a gut. I want to be able to exercise. I want to be able to go outside, and I don't feel safe doing that. So I'm going to carry a gun. Well, he decided that it actually was easier for him to carry a gun openly than concealed. He went through the licensing process. And so he ended up having attracting the attention of Detroit police, because here you have African-American man with, openly carrying a gun. And so one of the incidents that he described to me when I met him and that I talk about in my book is, he's on Woodward, which is, one of the main thoroughfares in Detroit. He's next to a bus stop, and, people are gathering, kind of around him as police come, with their hands on their guns to stop him and question him about, having this openly carried gun. So, the police run his numbers. The police put him in the back of the police car. He's like, I'm clean. I check out. And so, they run out everything. They say, okay, you check out. And so he gets out of the car, and the police hand him back his gun because it's legal, right? And he actually shared with me the audio recording, because he eventually started tape recording while he went out, just to have these, have this on record. And you can hear on this recording people clapping, at this bus stop, who are suddenly like, police gave this man back his gun and didn't take him to jail. Another guy I interviewed, his family had come up to Detroit from the Great Migration, and I asked him, okay, so what does it mean for you to carry a gun? And he responded, well, back in the day, my grandma used to shoot off her shotgun on the front porch down south to scare off the KKK. Now, today, I'm in Detroit and I carry my semi-automatic for self-defense. And so he really linked it as, this is a new iteration of a history that's been going on for quite a while.
But it's so interesting to me the way it both maps onto our history and our present. Some of the early fights over gun control and the early successes at gun control came after Black Panthers wielded guns, right? Showed guns outside, I believe it was the California state capitol. And it was Republicans at that time who quickly passed gun control. And sometimes I'll see these demonstrations from open carry advocates, and I wonder if the Black Lives Matter protests had 500 African-American protesters, each one of them holding a gun, what would Donald Trump's response be? What would the response of white America be? Because I don't think it would be to celebrate Second Amendment rights.
Yeah. So, there are groups that have done this. So the Huey Newton Gun Club in Dallas has, staged protests and protested in front of police stations, with regard to cases of deaths in custody and police violence and police perpetrated homicides. And they're fully armed and, armed with long guns when they do this. So this is happening. There are examples. And, I think that These don't get a lot of coverage, but examples where you do have groups of a variety, racial and gender identities and backgrounds who are open carrying together. So I think that actually does happen, but it doesn't get a lot of press when it does happen. If you look at Rick Ector, for example, he runs an organization called the tagline is "Get Laid, Get Legally Armed" in Detroit, and he is focused on arming African Americans. There is and I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm sure, because I only follow him on Twitter and Instagram, but Maj Touré, his tagline is Black Guns Matter. African-American man teaching African-Americans about gun safety and talking about gun rights. So there's actually a lot of that happening, but it's like there's this kind of cognitive dissonance in the media where, you'll have sort of the usual story about, what are guns all about in America? And then they'll be like, oh, but then there's, Rick Ector in Detroit doing this.
One thing I want to talk about here, because I do think it plays very deeply into how these debates end up going, is how the experience of having a gun on you changes your experience of the world. And you talk about this quite a bit in the book, the way in which the gun carriers that you interviewed and spent time with, they're constantly scanning for threats. They're sitting with a clear view of all the exits. They're existing within having the gun. It seems like it makes the world into much more of a drama in which they're the hero and they may be called to do these extraordinary, dangerous, heroic things at any moment. And it sounded to me like a really addictive, interesting way to approach the world, to enliven your day, particularly if other parts of your life at this point offer less opportunity for that kind of narrative and status and feeling of essentialness.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a bit of the gun being engrossing, right? It's this heavy thing that's on your hip. It's there. And certainly, I mean, this is in the NRA classes where, part of what they talk about is situational awareness, looking at your surroundings, running through scenarios, thinking through, if someone came through the door, how would things go down? And so that's definitely something that, is encouraged by these classes to think through sort of, and part of that is thinking through the implication that you have a lethal weapon on your person. One thing that I write about in my book, though, is that, there's a lot of emphasis on sort of, practice with your firearm, be able to unholster, know that you might have to shoot from an uncomfortable position. What happens if your dominant hand goes down and you have to shoot with your non-dominant hand? Think about all these contingencies and commit it to muscle memory. Be aware that, threats will, something could happen when when you least expect it and that sort of thing. But what is missing in the NRA courses and then the courses that I watched and observed in my research was that question of how do you know if a threat is actually a threat? And I think, of course, of race, of things like the weapons bias and the fact that social psychologists have shown that if you have a object that's, an ambiguous object that's associated with a darker skin face as opposed to a lighter skin face, you're more likely to see that object as a gun with a darker skin face. And if it is a gun with a white face, this is actually interesting, it'll take you longer to realize that that's a gun. That stuff isn't talked about in the NRA classes or in the classes that I observed. And so if we're going to have gun training classes, that needs to be part of the conversation. Not just do we see the threat, not just can we respond to the threat, but how do we know if a threat is actually a threat? That's a big missing piece of the puzzle.